She buried her husband on a Tuesday, and by Friday the town had already decided she wasn't worth saving. They took the house, they took her name, and they took every last thing she thought was permanent, leaving her standing in the dirt with a single trunk and a fury she didn't yet know what to do with. This is the story of Evelyn Mercer, a woman the world discarded, who walked into a broken wilderness and refused to break. If you're watching this to the end, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Like and follow so you never miss what happens next. The coffin cost more than they had. That was the first thing Evelyn thought when the undertaker slid the invoice across his desk. Not a word of condolence, not even the pretense of grief on his face, just the paper and his dry fingers pointing to the number at the bottom. She paid it. She paid it with the last of what Thomas had left in the tin box beneath the floorboards, the one she wasn't supposed to know about. She had known about it for years. She'd never touched a cent of it, because she believed, the way people believe in things they have no reason to doubt, that she would never have to. Thomas Mercer died on a gray morning in late October when the cottonwood trees along the creek had already gone bare and the air smelled like cold iron. He died in their bedroom, in their bed, with her hand around his, and her voice doing the only thing it still could, talking. She talked him through it. She told him about the garden she was going to plant in the spring, the one she'd been drawing plans for on brown paper for 3 years. She told him about the colt that had been born that autumn, and how it had his same stubborn look around the eyes. She talked until he stopped breathing, and then she sat there in the quiet for a long time before she went to tell anyone. That was the last quiet she would have for a while. Millhaven was not a cruel town. That was the thing that made what happened so difficult to carry. It wasn't cruelty that did it. It was something smaller, colder, harder to name. It was people deciding, one by one and with no great fuss, that Evelyn Mercer had become inconvenient. The trouble started with the house. The house had been Thomas's before it was theirs, purchased from a man named Aldridge Cope, who had moved east when his wife took ill. Thomas had bought it with money from his father's estate and a small loan from the Millhaven Agricultural Bank, and for 11 years they had lived in it together. And Evelyn had scrubbed its floors and patched its roof and grown things in its yard and known it, the way you know a place that has held your life. She had assumed, and this was her mistake, the lawyers were patient in explaining, she had assumed that a house becomes yours simply by living in it long enough. It does not. The loan had clauses. Thomas had never fully understood, or had understood and not told her about, and when he died those clauses activated like something that had been waiting. The bank did not move immediately. They gave her 30 days, which was the grace period, and she spent those 30 days trying to find a way out of the corner she was in. She wrote to Thomas's cousin in Denver. She asked at the bank about refinancing. She spoke with the town's one lawyer, a small, moist-eyed man named Cutter, who wore the same vest every day and who looked at her across his desk like she was a problem he didn't have the tools to fix. Widows' rights in this county are what they are, he said. That's the situation. What does that mean? It means the loan is in default and the property reverts. She looked at him. I've lived there 11 years. Yes, ma'am. I painted every room in that house. Cutter folded his hands. I understand that's difficult. She left without another word because she didn't trust what the next one would be. The 30 days passed. Then she had 2 weeks, and then she had 1. And in that final week, something shifted in Millhaven. Something she could feel the way you feel a change in weather before it actually changes. People stopped meeting her eyes on the street. At the dry goods store, conversations that had been mid-sentence when she walked in would somehow reach their natural conclusions very quickly. The minister's wife, a woman named Dorothea Phelps, who had brought Evelyn a pound cake when Thomas first took sick, now crossed to the other side of the road when she saw her coming. She was not imagining it. She had asked herself whether she was imagining it, gone through the whole argument with herself in the dark of the house she was about to lose, and concluded that she was not. What she had done was become the wrong kind of woman. She was a widow with no children, no family within 300 miles, no clear future, and this was the part nobody said out loud but everybody thought. A tendency to speak plainly and look people in the eye when they'd have preferred she looked at the floor. Thomas had been the buffer. Thomas had been well-liked, easy to talk to, one of those men who move through a community and generate goodwill by sheer temperament. With Thomas gone, there was no buffer, and Evelyn was just herself, which turned out to be more than Millhaven had bargained for. The eviction happened on a Wednesday. A man she didn't recognize arrived with two others and a paper with a seal on it, and they were polite about it. That was the thing. They were perfectly polite. And they stood on the porch while she carried her things out and loaded them into the small trunk and the two canvas bags that held everything she'd decided was worth taking. She left the curtains she'd sewn herself. She left the rocking chair her mother had sent from back east. She left the drawing of the garden she'd been planning for 3 years. She left them because she didn't have room, and because she didn't want to watch herself carry them down the steps like someone fleeing. She stood in the road for a moment after they'd gone inside, the trunk at her feet, the two bags beside it, the afternoon light going orange and long across the dirt. A woman named Harriet Bowles, who lived 2 houses down and who had come to every holiday supper Evelyn and Thomas had hosted, was standing on her own porch watching. Evelyn looked at her. Harriet looked at her. Then Harriet went back inside. Evelyn picked up her bags and walked to the boarding house on the far end of town, the one run by a widow named Mrs. Paulette Greer, who charged $2 a week and asked no questions. She took the room on the second floor that smelled like old wood and someone else's soap, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the gray light and did not cry, because she'd already decided that crying was something she'd done enough of in the last 30 days, and it had not helped anything. What she needed was a plan. She spent 3 days making one, or trying to. She went back to Cutter and asked about work. Any kind. Washing, cooking, mending. Cutter said he'd passed the word. The word did not come back with anything attached to it. She asked at the hotel if they needed help in the kitchen. The man at the desk looked her over in a way that made her wish she had something to throw, and said they were fully staffed. She went to the seamstress on Birch Street, who was kind, but had no need for another pair of hands. She went to the school teacher, who had been one of Thomas's friends, and who stood in his doorway with a pained, apologetic look, and said there was simply nothing he could do. By the end of the 3rd day, she had begun to understand that Millhaven was not going to help her. It wasn't going to be dramatic about it. It wasn't going to run her out of town or say anything directly. It was simply going to make itself unavailable until she made the decision to go somewhere else. That was how towns like this worked. You either fit the shape they had made for you, or you became too difficult to see. She was sitting on the steps of the boarding house that evening, watching the road, when the freight driver pulled up. He was a thick-armed man in his 50s named Oakes, with a beard the color of creek mud and a wagon loaded with dry goods and timber supplies. He stopped to water his horses and noticed her sitting there, and because he was the kind of man who talked to people without thinking too hard about whether he should, he said, "You look like a woman with nowhere to be." "That's an accurate observation," Evelyn said. He looked at her for a moment. "You looking for work?" "I'm looking for anything." He sat on the step beside her and pulled out a pipe and took his time lighting it, and then he told her about the Calloway Ranch. It was up in the mountains, he said, a good 2 days' ride from Millhaven on roads that were more suggestion than fact. Grant Calloway ran cattle up there, had done for 15 years. And the place was productive enough, but the man had been trying to keep a housekeeper for 2 years without success. They didn't last. Most of them were gone inside a week. The longest one had made it to 12 days before she'd walked out to the road and flagged down the first wagon heading back to civilization. "What's wrong with it?" Evelyn asked. Oakes exhaled smoke and looked at the far end of the road. "It's not a comfortable situation." "That's not what I asked." I was quiet for a moment. "Calloway's wife died 4 or 5 years back. He's got 2 girls, a 16-year-old who'd sooner bite you than look at you, and a little one, 9 or so, who hasn't said a word to anyone since her mother passed. Ranch itself is fine. The man himself is—" He paused. "He's not easy. Not mean, you understand. Just not easy. And no woman has lasted. No woman has lasted." Evelyn looked at the boarding house door behind her, and then at the town around her, and then at the mountains that were just visible above the rooftops to the north, going dark blue in the evening light. "When do you leave?" she asked. 6 in the morning. She had $1.70 left after paying Mrs. Greer. She offered Oakes the dollar for the ride, and he looked at her and said to keep it. There was room on the seat, and he was going that way regardless. She went upstairs and packed her 2 bags and slept in the narrow bed for the last time, and in the morning she was on the wagon seat beside Oakes before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. She did not look back at Millhaven. There was nothing there worth the effort. The road north went through meadow country first, flat and wide, the grasses still holding some of their summer color, and then it started climbing. By midday they were on switchbacks cut into rocky hillsides, the horses working harder, the air thinning and going cold at the edges. Oakes was good company in the way that people who spend most of their time alone are good company. He said things only when he had something to say, which meant that when he spoke, it was worth hearing. He told her about the Callaway land. It sat at 5,000 feet, spread across a valley with a creek running through the center and timber on three sides. The house was large enough, solidly built, and had been kept well when the wife was alive. Grant Callaway had come up from Texas originally, had driven cattle north, and then kept going until he found land that suited him. That was 15 years ago. He'd married a woman named Clara, a school teacher from the next valley over, and by all accounts they'd been well matched. What happened to her? Evelyn asked. Fever. It came fast and went faster. Oakes kept his eyes on the road. The little one, Sadie, found her. That's what they say. She was the one in the room when it happened. Evelyn absorbed that without comment. Harper, the older girl. She was 11 when it happened, old enough to understand what she'd lost, young enough that it changed the shape of her. He paused. She wasn't always like this, from what people tell me. Before she was outgoing, friendly, had friends in the valley. And now? Now she's a wall. He said it without judgment. The last housekeeper, woman named Mrs. Boyle out of Gretchen Flats, said Harper told her on the third day that if she touched anything that had belonged to her mother, she'd burn her dress while she slept. Did she mean it? Oakes considered. Probably not, but Mrs. Boyle wasn't interested in finding out. Evelyn looked out at the mountains and thought about a girl who threatened fire to protect the only things she had left. And the father, she said. Tell me about him. Oakes was quiet for a moment. Grant Callaway is a man who built something he was proud of and then watched it go wrong and couldn't figure out how to fix it. He's not cruel. He's not a drunk. He got stuck somewhere between grief and responsibility, and he never found his way back out. Another pause. He might not make you feel particularly welcome. I'm not expecting welcome, Evelyn said. I'm expecting a place to work. They stopped for the night at a way station run by an old couple who fed them salt pork and cornbread and charged 15 cents each, and in the morning they were back on the road. By midday the timber had closed in on either side and the air had a different quality, cleaner, harder, carrying the smell of pine resin and creek water. The valley opened up around a bend in the road, and there it was. Evelyn's first sight of the Callaway Ranch was honest, which was to say it was neither beautiful nor terrible. It was a place built by someone who understood function. The main house was 2 stories, built from timber and stone, with a covered porch running the full length of the front. The barn was large and well-maintained. There were corrals, a tool shed, a smokehouse, a kitchen garden gone to autumn weeds. Behind it all, the mountains rose up close and enormous, the peaks carrying the first white of the season. The whole place had a look about it that she couldn't quite name until she thought about it for a moment. Then she could name it. It looked like a house that had stopped expecting anything. Oakes pulled the wagon up near the barn, and a man came out. Grant Callaway was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't expected anything specific. He was tall and lean, with the kind of physical tiredness that lives in the shoulders. Not the tiredness of a day's work, but of years of it, without enough rest between. He had dark hair going gray at the sides, a jaw that needed a razor's attention, and eyes the color of old wood that looked at her and immediately looked away. He looked at Oakes instead. Brought your supplies, Oakes said. And something else. Grant's eyes came back to Evelyn. She's not from the agency. No, Oakes said. She's not. But she's looking for work, and you're looking for someone who'll stay. A silence. Grant looked at her the way you look at a sky when you're not sure what it's going to do. You know anything about ranch work? I know about keeping a house, Evelyn said. I know about cooking, washing, mending, tending a garden. I know about children. I don't need someone who knows about children, he said. I need someone who can manage a household. Those aren't separate things, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. You got experience? I kept a house for 11 years. In a town. Yes. This isn't a town. He looked out at the mountains, as if reminding himself of something. Previous women who came up here, they weren't weak. They just weren't prepared for what this place is. What is it? He seemed almost surprised by the question. Isolated, he said, after a moment. Hard. It doesn't accommodate people who need accommodating. I don't need accommodating, Evelyn said. I need work. Another long silence. Oakes was unloading supplies from the wagon with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided not to have an opinion about what's happening nearby. You'd have a room off the kitchen, Grant said finally. Meals and $1.50 a week. The work starts at first light and doesn't finish until dark. I won't apologize for any of that. I'm not asking for an apology. He nodded, once, as if something had been decided that he wasn't entirely at peace with. I'll put your things in. He took one of her bags without asking and carried it toward the house, and she picked up the other and followed him, and that was how it started. Not with warmth or welcome, but with a bag carried up the porch steps and a door held open and nothing said that didn't need saying. The house was as she'd expected, functional, clean enough, but with the particular emptiness of a space where someone used to be in charge, and nobody had properly filled the role since. The kitchen was large and had good equipment, a cast-iron stove that was well-maintained, a long table of heavy pine with benches on both sides. The pantry needed organizing. There was a season's worth of dust on the upper shelves. The curtains in the main room were the kind of fabric a woman with taste had chosen, and they were still good, just faded. Clara's mark was everywhere and nowhere. Not in any obvious way. No portraits, no personal items on display, but in the bones of the place. In the way the kitchen had been laid out, which was thoughtful. In the garden design, which had been made by someone who understood both beauty and practicality. In a row of books on a shelf in the main room that had been arranged by someone who read them. Evelyn noticed all of this and said nothing about it. Grant showed her the room off the kitchen. Small, with a single window facing east, a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a hook behind the door. It was plain, and it was private, and it was hers, which was more than she'd had in a week. Supper's at 6, he said. Harper will have started something. She handles the cooking most evenings. I can take that over. Not tonight. Let her have tonight. He said it without explanation, and she understood that there was history in the instruction she wasn't yet equipped to navigate. All right, she said. He left her to unpack, which didn't take long. She met Harper Calloway an hour later, in the kitchen. The girl was standing at the stove when Evelyn came in, stirring something in a heavy pot, with the focused attention of someone who is doing something mechanical so they don't have to think. She was tall for 16, she'd gotten her father's height, with dark red hair pulled back in a loose braid, and her mother's fine-boned face doing its best to look like something harder. She was wearing a work dress and an apron, and she had a smudge of flour on her forearm that she probably didn't know was there. She heard Evelyn come in and she did not turn around. I know you're there, she said. You can go back to your room. I'm not in your way, Evelyn said. Just getting some water. The pump's outside. I know where the pump is. Harper finally turned. She looked at Evelyn with the direct, assessing stare of someone who has been disappointed enough times to treat optimism as a character flaw. How long are you planning to stay? I don't know yet. The last one lasted 12 days. Before that was 9. Before that was 4. She said it flatly, like she was reading from a ledger. Mrs. Boyle said this place made her feel like something was wrong with her. She wasn't wrong. I'm not Mrs. Boyle. No, Harper said. You're not from the agency either. I heard Dad talking to the freight man. She turned back to the stove. He must be more desperate than he's letting on. It was meant to sting, and it landed where she'd aimed it. Evelyn accepted that and said nothing. What are we having? She asked instead. A beet. Bean soup, cornbread. Smells good. Harper didn't respond to that, but she didn't tell her to leave again either, which Evelyn decided to count as something. Sadie Calloway she saw at the table when supper was called. She almost didn't notice her at first. The girl was small for 9, with the quality of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. She had her mother's coloring, fair-skinned and light-eyed, with hair the color of dry hay that someone had combed carefully and tied with a piece of blue ribbon. She was already seated when Evelyn came in, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the table in front of her. Grant came in last, washed his hands at the basin near the door, sat at the head of the table without ceremony. Harper brought the pot from the stove and served without being asked, moving around her father and sister with the ease of long practice. Nobody spoke. That was the first thing. The silence at that table was not the comfortable silence of people at ease with each other. It was a silence with a shape, like furniture, like something that had been there so long it had become part of the room. Evelyn took the seat indicated by a minimal gesture from Grant, across from the girls, and accepted the bowl Harper set in front of her, and ate. She watched Sadie from the corner of her eye. The girl ate carefully, methodically, with complete attention to her food. She did not look up once. Evelyn had been told the child didn't speak, but she hadn't fully understood what that meant until now. It wasn't that she was shy or sullen, it was that she was genuinely absent from the conversation in a way that was different from shyness. She was there in body, and she was somewhere else entirely in every other way. Once Sadie reached for the cornbread and her hand knocked her cup, and it tilted, and Evelyn caught it before it went over. She set it back without making anything of it. Sadie looked up then, just for a moment, quick, reflexive, and Evelyn was already looking elsewhere, at something on the far wall, as if nothing had happened. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the girl study her for 1 second, 2, and then look back down at her plate. It was nothing. It was the smallest possible thing. She held on to it anyway. After supper, Grant went back out to the barn. Something about a fence post that needed attention before the cold came in. Harper washed the dishes with the efficiently aggrieved energy of someone who has been doing a task they believe they shouldn't have to do alone. And Evelyn dried without being asked and stacked everything where it had been stacked before, paying attention to where things went. "You don't have to do that," Harper said. "I know." Harper looked at her sideways. "You're trying to make me like you." "I'm trying to be useful," Evelyn said. "Whether you like me is your business." A long pause. Harper scrubbed at a pot with more force than it required. "She hasn't talked in 4 years," Harper said suddenly, and Evelyn knew who she meant without asking. "In case nobody told you, she talked before, plenty. She was—" Harper stopped. Her jaw tightened. "She was loud. Annoying. Like little sisters are." She said the last part in a different voice, careful, like she was handling something that still had edges. "What did the doctors say?" Harper made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Doctor came up once, 18 months ago, said there was nothing physically wrong, that she'd talk when she was ready." She set the pot down too hard. "He didn't say what to do if she's never ready." Evelyn didn't have an answer for that, and she didn't reach for one. "She knows what's going on around her," Harper said, after a moment quieter. "She understands everything. There's nothing wrong with her mind. I just want you to know that, because some people treat her like there is." "I could tell," Evelyn said. "At supper, she's paying attention to everything." Harper looked at her, and for 1 second the defensive architecture slipped just slightly, and she looked like what she was. A 16-year-old girl who was exhausted from holding up more than her share of the world. Then it was back. "Don't read too much into anything," Harper said. "That's the advice I'd give you. People who read too much into things around here end up disappointed." She took off her apron and hung it on the hook by the door and left the kitchen without looking back. Evelyn finished stacking the dishes, cleaned the stove, swept the floor, and then went to her room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to the mountain settle in around the house in the dark. It was quiet in a way that the town had never been quiet. Not peaceful, not yet, but deep. Like something waiting. She had no idea what she was doing here. She had no illusions about being the right woman for a job that had sent better women running. She had no strategy, no plan beyond the morning, no idea what Grant Calloway was going to be like once the novelty of a new housekeeper wore off and the daily friction set in. What she had was a room with a door she could close, a job with work she knew how to do, and the knowledge, the cold, clean, absolute knowledge, that whatever happened up here on this mountain could not be worse than what had happened in the town below. She lay down in her clothes and pulled the blanket up and looked at the ceiling and thought about Sadie's hand reaching for the cornbread, and the way the child had looked at her for 1/2 second before looking away again. She thought about 4 years of silence. She thought about how long that must feel when you're 9 years old. Outside, the wind came down off the high peaks and moved through the timber with a sound like water, and the house creaked once, twice, settling into the cold, and Evelyn Mercer, who had buried her husband, lost her home, been turned out by her town, and ridden 2 days into the wilderness on the word of a freight driver she'd met on a boarding house steps, closed her eyes, and after a while, slept. She was up before the light. That was her first decision. Not a grand one, not a gesture, just a practical choice. If she was going to be useful, she needed to be useful before anyone had a chance to tell her not to be. She built up the stove fire, which had gone to embers overnight, and had coffee on before the sky outside had turned from black to gray. She found flour and salt and the covered crock of sourdough starter, and began bread, her hands doing the work automatically, while her eyes went around the kitchen, learning it more thoroughly than she'd been able to the night before. She found where Clara had kept things. There was a logic to it, a careful logic that spoke of someone who had thought about how a kitchen worked rather than just where things happened to end up. Evelyn left everything where it was and worked around the existing system and found, within 30 minutes, that she understood it. She heard boots on the stairs and Grant came in, stopped short when he saw her. The fire was going, the coffee was ready, the bread was in the oven. He looked at the stove, then at her, then at the stove again. "You didn't have to start this early," he said. "I know." He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window looking out at the yard in the first gray light. She worked and said nothing and did not try to fill the silence with performance. After a while he said, "The fence on the east pasture needs checking after the cold snap. I'll be out until noon." "I'll have something hot at noon," she said. He looked at her then, a brief, assessing look, and nodded, and took his coffee and his hat and went out. She listened to his boots on the porch, and then the yard, and then the sound of him becoming part of the distance. The bread was going to need another 40 minutes. She used the time to start on the pantry. She was 3 shelves in when she heard small feet on the stairs, and looked up, and Sadie was standing in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown with her feet bare and her hair loose, holding a rag doll that was clearly very old and very loved, looking at Evelyn with those light, careful eyes. Evelyn did not stop what she was doing. She did not make a fuss, did not turn and face the girl and speak directly to her in the bright, careful voice that people used with children who were considered fragile. She simply reached the end of the shelf she was working on, moved to the next one, and said, in the same tone she'd used talking to herself, "Bread'll be done in about 30 minutes. Smells good already, doesn't it?" She kept her eyes on the shelf. Sadie stood in the doorway for a long moment, and then her feet made soft sounds on the floor as she crossed the kitchen to the table, and the bench scraped as she climbed up onto it, and the rag doll was settled in her lap. She sat there and watched Evelyn work. That was all. That was the whole of it. But Evelyn felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time, some quiet, specific thing, and she kept her face neutral and her hands moving and let the silence be what it was. The bread came out of the oven 28 minutes later, browned and solid, and she cut 2 slices and put them on the table with butter and a small jar of honey she'd found in the back of the pantry, and sat down across from Sadie and ate her own slice without making any particular point of the one she'd put down for the girl. Sadie looked at the bread. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at the bread again. Then she reached for it, still holding the doll against her chest with her other arm, and she ate. The morning light came through the kitchen window, thin and cold and bright. The first week taught her what the freight driver hadn't been able to put into words. It wasn't any single thing about the Calloway ranch that wore women down. It wasn't the isolation, or the cold, or the physical labor, though all of those were real enough. It was the cumulative weight of a household that had stopped believing things could be different. It sat in the air of every room, that particular heaviness, and you felt it when you walked from the kitchen to the main room, when you carried water up from the pump, when you set the table for supper and watched 3 people sit down and eat without looking at each other. The ranch functioned. The animals were fed, the fences mostly held, the firewood was cut and stacked. But functioning and living were 2 different things, and the Calloways had been doing the first while the second quietly starved. Evelyn did not try to fix it. That was her one deliberate decision in those first days. She was not going to walk into this family's grief and start rearranging it like furniture. She had seen what that looked like, the kind of well-meaning intrusion that announces itself as help and lands like an accusation. She had been on the receiving end of it in Mill Haven, people telling her with their eyes that she was doing widowhood wrong, that she should be softer or quieter or more willing to need them. She wasn't going to do that to anyone else. So she cooked and cleaned and kept the fire going and learned the rhythms of the ranch without announcing herself. She memorized who drank their coffee how. She figured out which floorboard in the hallway creaked and started stepping over it automatically. She noticed that Sadie always came downstairs before Harper, and that in the 15 minutes before her sister arrived, the little girl would sit at the kitchen table with her doll and watch Evelyn work with an attention that was not quite companionship, but was something in that direction. Evelyn talked during those 15 minutes, not to Sadie exactly, just out loud, the way a person talks when they're working alone. She'd say what she was making for breakfast, or comment on the weather coming through the window, or mention something small she'd noticed about the ranch. Sadie never responded. But she never left either. Harper remained a wall with good architecture. She was efficient and capable in ways that a 16-year-old shouldn't have had to become. She knew where everything was, how the household ran, what her father needed before he asked for it. She'd been keeping this place together with sheer stubbornness for years, and she wore that fact like armor, which meant that any offer of help landed as a kind of challenge. When Evelyn took over the supper cooking on the third day, Harper stood in the kitchen doorway and watched with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral, looking for something to criticize. She found it. The biscuits Evelyn made that evening were too thin. She hadn't known that Grant preferred them thick, nearly an inch, the way Clara had made them. Harper told her this the next morning in the flat, informational tone she used when she was being territorial without wanting to look like it. Noted, Evelyn said. Thank you. Harper had clearly been prepared for a different response. She stood there for a moment, recalibrating. My mother had a recipe in the book on the second shelf, she said finally. I'll look at it. Another pause. You don't have to use it. I know. She used it. The biscuits the next evening were right, and she saw Grant reach for a second one without comment, which was apparently as close as he got to a compliment about food. Harper noticed and said nothing, but she also stopped standing in the kitchen doorway watching, which felt like its own kind of progress. Grant Calloway remained the most difficult to read. He was consistent in the way that weather-beaten things are consistent. You could rely on him to be exactly what he was every single day, which was hard-working, direct, and about 30% more present physically than he was in any other sense. He ran the ranch with an expertise that was genuinely impressive. She had grown up around working men, and she recognized the difference between someone competent and someone who understood their land the way she understood a kitchen. He understood every inch of this property, how it worked, what it needed, where its limitations were. With his daughters, it was more complicated. It wasn't cold to them. He was something harder to name, there and also not quite there, in the way of a man who has learned that loving something too openly gives the world a specific target. He'd sit at supper, and he'd look at Sadie, and you could see him fighting some private battle, some conflict between wanting to reach toward her and not knowing how. And the result was that he'd end up looking at his plate. With Harper, he was more comfortable, because Harper dealt in practicality, and he understood practicality. They could talk about fence repairs and cattle, and whether the north pasture needed reseeding, and those conversations were real, but they were also the only ones they had. Evelyn watched all of this and kept her opinions to herself. It was on the 9th day that the first real thing happened. She had gone to the barn in the early afternoon to see about the garden tools. She'd been planning to clear the kitchen garden before the hard frost came in, and she wanted to know what she had to work with. She was in the back of the barn, pulling tools from their hooks and checking their condition, when she heard voices from the other side of the partition. Grant and Harper. She wasn't trying to listen, but the barn carried sound the way old wood does, and she heard it anyway. She's going to leave, Harper said. They always leave. Don't start. I'm not starting anything. I'm just saying, Harper. She's been here 9 days, and she's reorganizing the pantry, and she made Mom's biscuit recipe, and she sits there at supper like she's waiting for something. It's a pause. It makes me tired. Silence. Then Grant. She does her work. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not harsh, but heavier. But you can't keep running people off and then complain about being alone. I haven't run anyone off. Mrs. Boyle. She wasn't going to stay anyway. Harper. A long silence. When Harper spoke again, her voice had dropped and some of the hard edge was gone from it, and what was underneath it was a 16-year-old girl and nothing else. What if she's different? It wasn't a question. It was the most frightening thing she'd said. Then she'll be different, Grant said quietly. And then she'll leave anyway. And it'll be worse. Evelyn moved carefully back toward the barn door, making enough noise on the way out that no one could say she'd been listening. She went back to the house and started on the garden and worked until her back ached and the light went low, and she thought about a girl who'd protected herself so thoroughly against hope that she couldn't figure out which side of the wall she was on anymore. That evening, she did something she hadn't done since arriving. After supper, while Harper was washing up, Evelyn went to the shelf in the main room and took down one of the books. She settled into the chair by the stove with it. She wasn't performing anything. She was genuinely tired, and the chair was warm, and she wanted to sit for 20 minutes before bed. But Sadie, who had been at the far end of the room doing something quiet with her doll, watched her settle in and then, after a moment, got up and came across the room and sat on the floor beside the chair. Not on the chair. Not next to her. On the floor beside her, which was somehow more deliberate. Evelyn read her page. She didn't look down. She didn't say anything or adjust anything about what she was doing. She just read, and the fire went on making its sounds, and Sadie sat on the floor with her doll and was simply there. After a while, Harper came in from the kitchen and stopped in the doorway and looked at her sister on the floor, and her expression did something complicated and fast. Then she sat down on the far end of the settee and picked up her mending, and the three of them were in the same room in something that wasn't quite peace, but was something that peace might be made of later, given time. Grant came in from outside around 8, brought the smell of cold air and wood smoke with him, and stopped when he saw the room. He looked at it, the fire, the three of them, the ordinary domestic quiet of it, and something moved across his face, there and gone so fast she almost missed it. Something that looked like grief wearing the wrong expression. He went to bed without saying much, but he didn't leave as fast as usual. The days found their shape. Evelyn cleared the kitchen garden and turned the soil and mapped out in her mind what it would look like in spring, what needed planting where. She repaired the curtains in the main room where they'd started to fray, using thread she'd found in Clara's sewing box, choosing the closest match she could find so the repair would disappear. She taught herself the particular moods of the cast iron stove, its hot spots, how much wood it liked, how early you had to start it to have the kitchen warm by first light. She found small ways to make the house more livable that weren't dramatic enough to comment on. She discovered things about each of them that they hadn't told her. Harper was trying to teach herself cartography. She found the maps, hand-drawn, careful, detailed, folded between the pages of a book she'd left on the kitchen table one morning. When Evelyn mentioned it, offhand, Harper looked like she'd been caught at something embarrassing. "It's just something I do," she said. "It's nothing." But her eyes said something different. "Where did you learn it?" Evelyn asked. "From a book," Harper said, defensive. "There are surveying manuals in the main room." She paused. "Mom used to say maps were just someone's argument about what matters." Evelyn looked at the map on the table. The way Harper had noted not just roads and landmarks, but water sources, tree lines, elevation estimates. "Your mother was right," she said. "These are good." Harper took the map off the table and put it back in the book, but she left the book on the table, which was a different thing than putting it away. Grant rode out most mornings before light, came back at noon, went out again in the afternoon. He talked to her in the spare, functional way of someone who has reduced conversation to its load-bearing elements. He'd tell her what supplies he needed, what the weather looked like, whether he'd be in for the midday meal or taking it in the field. She answered in kind, no more than necessary, but she noticed that he'd started pausing in the kitchen doorway before he went back out after lunch, sometimes for 30 seconds, sometimes longer, not saying anything, just standing there, and she thought he might be figuring out how to have a different kind of conversation and not quite getting there yet. She was patient about it. She had nothing else to be. The trouble with Sadie was different from the other troubles because it wasn't a problem she could work around the edges of. 4 years of silence was not a curtain to move or a biscuit recipe to correct. She watched the girl and tried to understand what had built up around her, this wall of quiet. Sadie was clearly intelligent. She was observant. She noticed things adults didn't notice, registered changes in a room's atmosphere the way a good weather instrument registers pressure. She did her schoolwork. Grant had her working through books at the kitchen table each morning, and she did it thoroughly, including the writing portions, filling pages with careful letters in an exercise book. She just didn't say any of it out loud. Evelyn tried something on the 14th day that she wasn't sure about. She found a piece of blank paper and put it on the table where Sadie usually sat, with a pencil beside it, before the girl came down in the morning. She didn't say anything about it. She just left it there and went about her work. When she came back to the kitchen 20 minutes later, Sadie had written one word on the paper. Hungry. Evelyn looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the stove and made eggs and put a plate in front of the girl and said, "Good thing I was already on it." Sadie watched her. Her expression didn't change much, but something in her eyes had some tiny shift, the way ice sounds in late February when the temperature comes up just slightly, just enough. The paper stayed on the table. There were more words on it by the end of the day, and the day after, and by the end of the week it had become something, Not conversation exactly, but the outline of one. Evelyn would ask simple questions, not requiring answers, just leaving them in the air. Sadie would sometimes write something on the paper later and leave it for her to find. The brown hen is sick, or Harper burned the coffee again, or just cold today. Harper found one of these notes and stood at the kitchen table reading it with an expression that Evelyn carefully did not look at directly. She hasn't done this with anyone else, Harper said after a moment. Her voice was working to stay neutral and not entirely succeeding. Written things down, for people. She communicates the way that works for her, Evelyn said. Harper put the note back on the table. Don't make her into a project, she said, and it came out harder than she probably intended, and then she caught herself and added lower, please. I'm not, Evelyn said. I'm just paying attention. Harper looked at her for a long time. That's what you do, isn't it? You just pay attention. It's mostly what anyone needs. The girl's jaw worked for a moment. She looked out the window at the yard. My mother paid attention like that, she said finally, and it cost her to say it. Evelyn could see exactly what it cost. Every person she talked to felt like the only person in the room. She sounds like someone worth knowing. She was. Harper picked up the note again, looked at it. Sadie was the most like her. That's why... She stopped. That's why it hit her the way it did. The kitchen held the silence between them, and neither one of them tried to fill it, and that was the right thing. That evening, for the first time, Grant stayed at the table after supper was finished. He didn't announce it or make anything of it. He just didn't get up when he usually got up. He sat with his coffee and looked at the table, and Harper and Evelyn cleaned up around him, and Sadie sat across from her father with her doll. And after a while, Grant said, to no one in particular, the north pasture fence needs resetting before snow, whole east section. He said it the way he'd say it to himself, not expecting a response. Harper said, I can help Saturday. Don't need help. I know, she said. I'll be there at 7. He looked at his daughter, this girl who was so much like him, it probably hurt sometimes, and he didn't argue. Sadie reached across the table and put her hand on the paper that had been sitting there all day, and pushed it toward her father. He looked down at it. Evelyn couldn't see from where she stood what was written, but she saw Grant's face when he read it. Something coming undone in him, quiet and private, lasting only a second before he got it back under control. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. Later, when everyone had gone to bed, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table in the dark with the last of the coffee and let herself feel the weight of where she was and what she was trying to do. She was under no illusions. 3 weeks didn't fix 4 years. A girl learning to write notes was not the same as a girl who could speak her own name out loud. A father pocketing a piece of paper was not the same as a family healed. Harper's wall was lower than it had been, but it was still there, and it would come back up if she pushed wrong. Grant's distance hadn't closed, just adjusted. None of this was fixed. But something had started, and she knew the difference between something starting and nothing happening, and she was going to hold on to that difference with both hands for as long as she needed to. Outside, the first real snow of the season had begun to come down, soft and steady in the dark, covering the yard and the barn roof and the garden she'd cleared and the fence posts on the east pasture, covering everything equally the way snow does, making the whole mountain quiet in a way that was different from the quiet inside the house. This was the kind of quiet that held things gently rather than the kind that swallowed them. She listened to it for a while. Then she washed her cup, banked the stove, and went to bed. The snow came and stayed. By the time December settled over the valley, the ranch had taken on the particular character that deep winter gives to isolated places. A compression of life into smaller spaces, the barn closer, the house warmer, the distances between people both shorter and somehow more significant. The mountains closed in white around them, and the world below might as well have been a different country. Evelyn had been at the ranch for 6 weeks. In that time, she had learned that Grant woke at 4:30 every morning, regardless of weather or season, that he took his first cup of coffee standing at the kitchen window before he said a word to anyone, and that the silence in those first minutes was not unfriendly. It was just his. She had learned that Harper's maps had gotten more sophisticated, that the girl had begun annotating them with notes about soil quality and water drainage in the margins, and that when she was proud of something she'd made, she'd leave it slightly more visible than usual, not showing it off exactly, just not hiding it. She had learned that Sadie collected things, small stones, a blue jay feather, a length of red ribbon, objects that meant nothing to anyone else and everything to her. and kept them in a wooden box under her bed with a seriousness of purpose that made Evelyn think of curators, of people who understand that ordinary things can be worth preserving. And she had learned about herself, that this place had gotten into her in a way she hadn't planned for. She hadn't come up the mountain looking for something to care about. She'd come because she had nowhere else to go. But somewhere in the dailiness of it, the bread and the fires and the notes on the paper and the evenings in the main room, she had started caring anyway, which was inconvenient and also, she suspected, already too late to do anything about. It was Oakes who brought the first news. On a Thursday in early December, when he came through with a winter supply run, his wagon slower than usual on the snow-packed road. He stayed for coffee and said it casually, the way a man says a thing he assumes everyone already knows. "Drake's been asking about this property," he said. Grant was still. "Drake. Vernon Drake. He's been operating out of Gretchen Flats for the last year, buying up land and water rights in the Valley Corridor. Paid Whitmore's ranch half its worth and then turned around and sold the water access to the mining consortium for 3 times what the whole property cost him." Oakes wrapped both hands around his cup. "He's been asking particular questions about this place. The creek access. The water table." Grant's jaw tightened. He can ask. He's not just asking. He had a lawyer up in the county seat pull the deed records on this section 2 weeks ago. Oakes looked at him steadily. "Thought you should know." After Oakes left, Grant stood at the kitchen window for a long time without turning around. Evelyn went on with what she was doing. She had learned that he needed to be in his own thoughts first, before anything. "You know who he is?" she asked finally. "I've heard of him." His voice was flat. "He buys what people can't hold on to." "And can you hold on to it?" He turned then. He looked at her the way he sometimes did when she asked a direct question, like he was checking whether she meant it, whether it was actually her business. Apparently he decided it was. "I'm carrying a loan from 3 years back. Bad cattle year. Disease went through half the herd and I had to rebuild. The loan's with Meridian Agricultural out of the county seat, and it's current, but it's not comfortable." He said it without apology or performance of ease, just the facts of the situation. If someone wanted to make it difficult, there are ways. How? Call in the terms early if they can get a legal angle. Put pressure on the lender. Create problems that cost money to solve. He looked back out the window. Drake's done it before. He finds the crack and he pries. She thought about that for the rest of the day. Vernon Drake arrived in person 2 weeks before Christmas, on a day when the sky was the flat white of a held breath, and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that made the air feel breakable. He came in a good carriage with a driver, which was how you knew he was from elsewhere. Nobody local used a carriage on mountain roads in December. I was perhaps 50, with the kind of maintained appearance that takes daily attention, shaved close, dressed in wool that cost real money, with pale eyes set in a face that had probably been handsome once and had since organized itself around something calculating. He was polite. That was the first and most important thing about him. He was extremely polite. Grant met him in the yard. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window, not hiding, just watching. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read the body language. Drake was relaxed, almost casual, doing the talking while Grant stood with his arms at his sides and his weight slightly forward. The posture of a man who wants the conversation to be over. At one point, Drake gestured at the mountains behind the ranch, an expansive sweep of his arm, and Grant said something short. Drake smiled. Grant did not. The meeting lasted maybe 15 minutes. Drake got back in his carriage, and his driver turned it around in the yard, and they went back down the mountain road. Grant came into the kitchen and stood at the basin and washed his hands with more force than was needed. "He made an offer," he said. Evelyn waited. "Below market value, significantly." He dried his hands. "He dressed it up. Said the property was going to be difficult to hold through the next 2 years given the loan climate. Said he was doing me a favor by offering anything." He put the towel down. Said he had connections at Meridian who could make the terms harder. "Is that a threat?" "It's a statement of fact that functions as a threat. That's how he operates, apparently." He looked at the window. "I told him the property wasn't for sale." "How did he take that?" Grant's expression didn't change much, but there was something in it. "He said he understood, and he'd give me time to reconsider, and he wished my family well." He paused. The way he said family. Evelyn looked at him. "He knows about the girls," Grant said. "He knows about Sadie. He mentioned, very politely, that he'd heard there were some questions about the household situation, whether it was stable. whether the children were being properly looked after. His voice had gone very quiet. He mentioned the county welfare board. The kitchen was silent except for the stove. He wouldn't, Evelyn said. He would, Grant said. That's the point. He found the crack. She understood then, fully, what they were dealing with. A man who had looked at a family and found its most vulnerable point and was prepared to press on it. A man who understood that Grant Calloway could withstand financial pressure better than he could withstand a threat to his daughters. She spent that evening in the main room with the girls, quieter than usual, thinking. Harper sensed something had shifted. The girl was perceptive about atmospheric changes, and she looked at Evelyn twice with a question in her face that Evelyn answered with a small shake of her head. Not yet. Sadie, who always sensed things in her own particular way, came and sat beside her on the settee instead of the floor. She sat there with her doll and her wooden box of collected things, and after a while she opened the box and took out the blue jay feather and held it out to Evelyn. Evelyn took it carefully. She looked at it, iridescent, still perfect, extraordinary, in the way small, beautiful things are when you actually look at them. Thank you, she said. Sadie took it back and returned it to the box and closed the lid with the seriousness of someone completing an important transaction. Evelyn thought about a man in a good wool coat who had looked at these children and seen a leverage point. She thought about what she was willing to do about it. The county welfare board sent a representative in January. His name was Phelps, no relation to the minister's wife from Mill Haven, though she thought of her anyway. And he arrived with papers and an apologetic manner and eyes that moved around the house assessing things. He had received a report, he explained, concerning the welfare and stability of the minor children on the property. He needed to conduct an evaluation. Grant let him in. His face was a controlled thing, the expression of a man keeping something very tightly in place. The house was clean. The pantry was full. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the bread Evelyn had made that morning. She had been aware, with cold clarity, that this visit was coming. Grant had told her 3 days before, and she had made every practical preparation that could be made without staging anything artificial. This was their actual life. It either looked like enough or it didn't. Phelps walked through the house. He asked questions in the tone of a man performing a checklist. Were the children attending to their schooling? Were they receiving adequate nutrition? Was the household stable? Grant answered each one. Yes. 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 Phelps looked at Harper, who stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed and answered his questions about her schoolwork with the clipped precision of someone who despises the implication behind them. Then he asked to speak with Sadie. The room shifted. Grant's controlled expression developed a fault line. She doesn't speak, he said. She's been assessed by a physician. There's nothing physically wrong. She communicates in other ways. Phelps made a note. The report indicated concerns about the child's development, her social engagement. What report? Grant said. Who filed it? I'm not able to disclose. Vernon Drake, Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. She hadn't planned to say it out loud, but there it was. Phelps's expression did something careful. I'm not at liberty to discuss the source. You don't have to, she said. A man came to this property 6 weeks ago and made an offer for the land and water rights and was told no. 3 weeks later, a welfare inquiry arrives. She looked at him steadily. I'd like to know what specific concern about these children warranted this visit, because I have been in this house for 2 months, and I have not seen anything that a reasonable person would consider neglect. Ma'am, I understand I'm not finished. She wasn't angry, precisely. She was something colder than angry, which was more useful. Sadie Calloway does not speak verbally. She writes, she reads. She tends to her schoolwork every morning, and she knows more about the flora on this mountain than most adults. Her sister looks after her with more care than most mothers I've seen. Her father works this land from before first light to after dark to provide for his children. She paused. What you're doing right now, coming up this mountain on the word of a man who wants what these children's father won't sell him, is the specific opposite of welfare protection. The kitchen was very quiet. Phelps looked at his papers. Something in his posture had changed. He was less settled in it than he'd been 10 minutes ago. I have an obligation to follow up on any report, regardless of source. I understand that, Evelyn said. And now you've followed up. What do you see? He looked around the kitchen again. At the bread on the counter, the orderly shelves, the school books on the table. At Harper standing with her arms still crossed but her eyes slightly wide. At Sadie, who was sitting at the table with her wooden box and her doll, watching Phelps with those light, precise eyes of hers. Sadie picked up her pencil. She wrote something on the paper in front of her and turned it around so Phelps could see it. He leaned forward and read it. Evelyn couldn't see what it said from where she stood, but she saw Phelps's face, and she saw him sit back in his chair and let out a slow breath and look at the little girl across the table with an expression that was, for the first time since he'd arrived, completely unguarded. "What does it say?" Harper asked. Phelps turned the paper around. "We are fine. Please go home." Harper made a sound, half laugh, half something that wasn't. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Grant looked at the paper and looked away at the window, and the side of his face did something complicated. Phelps closed his file. "I'll note the household is in good order," he said. His voice was different now. "I don't anticipate further inquiries from this office." He left 20 minutes later, and the carriage that had brought him went back down the mountain road, and the five of them stood in the yard in the cold and watched it go. Grant put his hand briefly on top of Sadie's head. Quick, a little awkward, the gesture of a man relearning how. Sadie stood very still under it and didn't move away. But Vernon Drake did not give up. In February, he escalated. He contacted Meridian Agricultural, and, through what channels Evelyn could only guess, arranged for the bank to send Grant a letter formally reviewing the terms of the loan. Not calling it in, not yet, but flagging irregularities in the payment schedule that amounted to the same threat dressed in bank language. Grant brought the letter to the kitchen table, and she read it beside him, and she could feel the weight of it settle over him like something physical. "He's not bluffing," Grant said. "No," she agreed. "If Meridian accelerates the repayment schedule, I can't meet it. Not in the current season." He folded the letter. His hands were steady. She had noticed that about him. When things were genuinely serious, he went very still, very controlled, the opposite of panic. "I'd have to sell off stock to cover it, which means the spring breeding operation takes a loss, which means next year is harder. And if he keeps applying pressure, then it compounds." He looked at the folded letter. "He doesn't have to buy the ranch outright. He just has to make me unable to keep it." The court hearing was called for March, which was Drake's other move. He'd managed to resurrect the welfare concern through a different channel, this time as a formal petition to the county family court requesting an evaluation of parental fitness. It was a technicality wrapped in legal language, and Evelyn understood exactly what it was. A way to force Grant into a public arena where Drake's lawyers could perform, where the rumor about Sadie's silence could be made to look like something it wasn't, where a man with resources and local legal connections could make a grieving widower with a mute daughter look like an inadequate father. She made a decision the night before the hearing. She told Grant at supper, just the two of them, the girls having gone up early. She told him what she was going to do, what she was going to say in that courtroom. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened when something mattered. When she finished, he said, "You don't have to do this." "I know. It's not your Grant." She looked at him across the table. "I have been in this house for 3 months. I have watched those girls, and I know what they're worth. I know what you're worth. I'm not going to sit in the back of that courtroom and be quiet about it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he said. Not a challenge, a real question. She thought about it honestly. "Because someone should have stood up in a room and said something true about me when I needed it," she said, "and nobody did." I was quiet after that. In the morning, they drove the wagon down the mountain to Gretchen Flats, all 4 of them, with Harper wearing her best dress and her jaw set, and Sadie in the wagon bed with her doll and her wooden box, watching the trees go by with her usual attention. The courtroom was not large, and it was already full when they arrived. Drake was there with 2 lawyers and a quality of ownership about the whole situation that made Evelyn's teeth clench. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Whitfield, who wore reading glasses on a chain and who looked at everything with the focused patience of someone who has heard every version of every argument and is waiting for a reason to be surprised. Drake's lawyers went first. They were good. She had to grant that. They laid out their concern for the children with practiced compassion, never mentioning Drake's name in connection with the land dispute, making it sound purely about welfare. They discussed Sadie's silence with clinical seriousness, implying without stating that it indicated a household that had failed a vulnerable child. They referenced the mother's death, the years without a stable female presence, the housekeeper revolving door, all of it, building a portrait of a man too absorbed in his land to properly parent his daughters. It was a portrait with enough truth in the brushstrokes that it was hard to argue against on its own terms. Then Evelyn stood up. She had not prepared a speech. She had thought about what was true and decided to say that. She said she had come to the ranch with nothing except work she could do, and she had done it. She described what she had seen in 3 months. Not a household in crisis, but a household in grief, which was a different thing, and one that any decent person would recognize the difference between. She said that Grant Calloway had never missed a day of provision for his daughters, had kept the ranch producing through a disease year that would have broken other men, had sat at that kitchen table every evening for years, being present in the only way he currently knew how. She said that Harper had held this family together with a willfulness that was going to either make her extraordinary or exhaust her, and that both of those outcomes were the direct result of a girl who cared too much, not too little. She said that Sadie communicated with a precision and intelligence that most adults couldn't match, and that silence was not the same as absence, and that any evaluation that could not tell the difference between a child who was traumatized and a child who was neglected was not an evaluation worth the paper it was filed on. She said that the petition before the court had been initiated by a man who had made a business offer to Grant Calloway, been refused, and then found the most painful possible leverage point. Drake's lead lawyer stood up. "Objection, Your Honor, this is—" "Sit down," Judge Whitfield said, without looking up from her notes. Evelyn kept going. She said she had been in Millhaven when Thomas died. She said she knew what it looked like when a community decided someone was inconvenient. She said the difference between what had happened to her and what was happening to Grant Calloway now was that Grant had something worth taking, which at least gave the prejudice an honest motive. The room was very quiet when she sat down. Judge Whitfield looked at her over the reading glasses. She didn't say anything. She wrote something on her pad and then she looked at the room. "Is the child present?" she asked. Grant said yes. One of the bailiffs went and brought Sadie in from the anteroom where she'd been waiting with Harper. She walked in holding her doll, wearing her best dress, looking at the courtroom with the expression of someone assessing new terrain. Judge Whitfield looked at her for a moment. "Young lady," she said, "my name is Judge Whitfield. You don't have to say anything to me if you don't want to." Sadie looked at her. "I only want to ask, do you want to stay with your father?" The courtroom held its breath. Sadie stood there for a moment, this small 9-year-old girl in her good dress with her rag doll held against her chest, and then she looked at her father sitting at the table across the room, and something passed across her face, something resolved, something decided. She opened her mouth. The sound that came out was small and rough from years of disuse, and it cracked in the middle, and it was the most complete silence breaker Evelyn had ever heard. "Yes," Sadie Calloway said, "I want to stay home." The courtroom erupted. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories, but in the way that real rooms react when something real happens. A collective intake of breath, then movement, then sound. Then someone at the back began to say something and someone else shushed them, and the judge brought her gavel down twice and said, "Order." And through all of it, Grant Calloway was sitting at the table with his face in his hands. Harper, from the gallery, made a sound that had no word for it. Sadie stood in the middle of the courtroom floor, looking at the reaction with wide eyes, like she hadn't entirely meant for it to be that much. And Evelyn went to her and put a hand between her shoulder blades and said very quietly, just to her, "You did that exactly right." Judge Whitfield needed 3 strikes of her gavel to get the room back. When she had it, she looked at Drake's lawyers with an expression that could have stripped paint. "The petition," she said, "is denied." Drake sat at his table with his polished shoes and his expensive lawyers and his careful face, and for the first time Evelyn saw something slip in it, just briefly, just enough. It was not over, she knew that, and Grant knew it, and the debt at Meridian Agricultural was still a real debt with real terms, and a denied petition was not the same as a defeated man. Vernon Drake did not become what he was by accepting one courtroom loss, but on the wagon ride back up the mountain, with the late afternoon light going orange across the snow and Harper sitting in the back with her arm around her sister, and Sadie leaning against her without the doll for once, just herself, and Grant driving with his hands easy on the reins for the first time since Evelyn had known him. On that wagon ride, with all 4 of them going home in the cold light, it felt like something had changed in the bones of things. Not fixed, not finished, but changed. The letter from Meridian Agricultural arrived on a Tuesday, 8 days after the hearing. Evelyn was in the kitchen garden when Grant came out of the house with it, and she knew from the way he walked, not fast, not slow, just deliberate in the way of a man carrying something he needs to set down somewhere, that it was not good news. She pulled off her work gloves and met him at the porch steps. He handed her the letter without preamble. She read it standing in the thin March light. The language was formal and impersonal in the way that institutional language is when it wants to avoid the appearance of being what it is. Meridian Agricultural was formally notifying Grant Calloway that due to a review of current loan terms and market conditions, the outstanding balance on the property note would require accelerated repayment. The full sum, $460, was due within 60 days. She read it twice. Then she handed it back. "He got to them," she said. "Yes." "Can you get $460 in 60 days? He folded the letter along its original creases, the way people fold things they've already decided what to do about. "Not without selling off breeding stock. Maybe not even then." He looked out at the ranch, the barn, the corrals, the timber on the ridge, going green in the early spring light. "If I sell what I'd need to sell to cover it, I won't have enough of a breeding operation left to make next year work. And if next year doesn't work, the year after is worse," she finished. "That's how it goes." He put the letter in his coat pocket. "Drake knows that. He's not trying to buy the ranch anymore. He's just trying to make it so I can't hold it, and then pick it up for nothing from the bank." She stood on the porch steps and looked at him. This man who had built something real on a mountain and was now being systematically dismantled by someone who had never once put his hands in the dirt of it. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her. "Grant, sit down. I need to tell you something." He sat on the porch steps, which was where they sometimes ended up in the evenings when the weather allowed it, and she sat beside him, and she told him about the money. She had thought about how to do this for several weeks. Not whether to, but how. Thomas had put aside $420 over 11 years of careful living, money set aside from good harvests and small economies, and the kind of long-term thinking that people who grew up with nothing tend toward. He had kept it in a leather pouch inside a tin box under the floorboards, and Evelyn had known about it the whole time, and she had paid the undertaker and kept the rest. She had carried it in the lining of her trunk through the eviction, through the boarding house, up the mountain on Oakes's wagon. She had not spent a cent of it, not even in the worst of Millhaven, because she'd understood instinctively that it was the kind of money you held until the moment that genuinely required it. She described it plainly. $420. Not enough to cover the full amount, but close enough that the gap was bridgeable. Grant was quiet for a long time when she finished. He looked at the yard, then at the mountains, then at the folded letter through his coat pocket as if he could feel its shape. "That's your money," he said. "Yes." "Your husband's money." "Yes." "Evelyn." He said her name the way he said things when he was working to keep his voice level. "I can't take that." "I'm not offering it as a gift," she said. I'm not asking you to take it. I'm telling you it exists, and I'm telling you that I think it should be used, and I'm asking you to have a conversation with me about what that looks like." He looked at her then, really looked at her, which he did less often than you'd think for a man who was observant about everything else. He had a particular way of looking at things he was uncertain about. Not suspicious exactly, but careful, the way you're careful around something that might be more fragile than it appears, or more significant. "Why?" he said. Same word as before the hearing, same weight behind it. "Because I've been here 4 months, she said. "Because those girls are... Because I'm not the same person I was when I got off that wagon. And some of that is this place, and some of it is them, and some of it is you. And I'm not going to sit here and watch Vernon Drake take it, because I held on to money. I was saving for a reason, and this is clearly the reason." He was quiet again. A long quiet. "There'd still be a $40 gap," he said finally. "I know. I might be able to cover $40 if I sell 2 of the yearlings." "That's what I thought." He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he looked away at the mountains, and she could see him working through it. Not the financial calculation. He'd already done that. But something else, some reckoning with what it meant that she was sitting on this step offering him the last physical remnant of her previous life. "I don't know how to..." He stopped. "You don't have to know how to anything right now," she said. "We just need to solve the 60-day problem." He was quiet a beat longer. Then he nodded, once. She had expected to feel something when she made the offer. Some grief for Thomas. Some fear about what she was committing to. What she felt instead was the particular clarity that comes when you stop holding something in reserve and finally use it for what it was meant for. Thomas had saved that money for emergencies, for futures, for the kind of moment where having it or not having it would determine what happened next. This was that moment exactly. She thought he would have understood. They told Harper that evening. Harper's response was more complicated than either of them was prepared for. She sat at the kitchen table and listened, and when they finished, she said nothing for almost a minute, which was unusual for a girl who typically had an opinion forming before you'd finished your sentence. When she finally spoke, she looked at Evelyn. "You're spending your husband's money on us," she said. "Yes." "Why would you do that?" "Harper," Grant started. "No, I want her to answer it." Harper's voice was not hostile. It was the voice of someone asking a question they genuinely need answered. "You came here because you had nowhere else to go. That's what the freight man said. You didn't come here for us. So why would you spend the last money you have in the world on people you've known for 4 months?" Evelyn looked at the girl across the table. 16 years old, red-haired, sharp-eyed, asking the most direct question anyone had asked her since she arrived. "Because it stopped feeling like 4 months somewhere around month 2, she said. "And because I've been given charity I didn't want and didn't ask for, and this is different. This is a choice. I'm making it because I want to." Harper looked at her. The architecture was down, all of it, for the first time, completely down. What was underneath was just the girl, tired and scared and hoping so hard it was almost visible. "And then what?" Harper said. "After the loan's paid, then what happens?" The kitchen held that question. It was Grant who answered it. He said it quietly, not looking at either of them, looking at the table. "That depends on whether—" He stopped, started again. "That depends on Evelyn." Evelyn looked at him. He looked up then. He met her eyes across the table in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke and 4 months of shared ordinary life. And he said, "I'm not good at this. I'm aware of that. I haven't been. I know what I haven't been." He said it with the precision of a man who has thought about something honestly and doesn't like all of what he found. "But I'm asking if you'd be willing." Harper looked between them, and her mouth went slightly open. "You're asking me to marry you," Evelyn said. "Yes." "At the kitchen table." "I don't—" He looked briefly at a loss, which was the most unguarded she'd seen him. "I don't have a better setting prepared. I thought—" "Grant!" He stopped. "Yes," she said. "I would." Harper put her elbows on the table and her face in her hands and made the sound of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally, cautiously, set it down. From upstairs, small and clear, the voice still finding its range after months of use, still sometimes rough at the edges, came Sadie's voice. "I heard that." The three of them looked at the ceiling. "She's been listening from the stairs," Harper said into her hands. "For how long?" Grant asked. A pause from upstairs. Then, "A while." Grant looked at Evelyn, something in his face that wasn't quite a smile but was what a smile is made of. "She does that," he said. "I'm aware," Evelyn said. They were married on the first Saturday in April, in the main room of the ranch house, with Oakes as witness, and Harper standing beside Evelyn with her best ribbon in her hair and her jaw set against any display of emotion she couldn't control. Sadie stood beside her father in a dress she'd asked Harper to press twice, holding her doll with one arm and Grant's hand with the other, and she said nothing during the ceremony, but afterward she looked up at Evelyn and said, in her particular careful way, "You live here now, officially." "I've been living here for 5 months," Evelyn said. "That was different," Sadie said. "That was temporary. This is official." Oakes ate 3 pieces of the cake Evelyn and Harper had made the day before and said it was the best wedding cake he'd ever tasted, which Harper said was because it was the only wedding cake he'd ever tasted, and he said that was probably true, but it didn't make him wrong. The marriage certificate was filed at the county seat. The Calloway name was now hers, which was both practical. It complicated Drake's angles considerably. And something else she didn't examine too closely, because it was still new, and she wanted to give it room before she decided what to call it. The money was harder. She had not told Grant about the full difficulty of retrieving it. The pouch was in her trunk, sewn into the lining along the bottom seam. She'd put it there in Millhaven when she'd understood the eviction was coming, sewing it in by lamplight the night before they came for the house. She'd carried it like that for months, this dense weight in the bottom of the trunk that she'd become so used to she sometimes forgot it was there. She cut the stitches on a Sunday afternoon and laid the pouch on the kitchen table and counted the bills out flat. 40-year-old notes and newer ones, coins wrapped in cloth to keep them from making noise. Everything Thomas had set aside over 11 years of married life. She counted it twice. $418, 2 cents. She'd miscounted slightly before. Grant sat across from her and watched her count it and didn't say anything until she was finished. That's everything he left you, Grant said. That's everything he saved, she said. It's not the same thing. She said it without sentiment, just as the fact it was. Thomas had left her 11 years of marriage and a garden plan drawn on brown paper, and the knowledge that there were people who would choose you and stand by the choice. The money was separate. The money was just an instrument for whatever came next. Grant sold 2 yearlings the following week at the Gretchen Flats market, and with what he got from that and Evelyn's $418, they had $471, 11 more than the loan required. She insisted they keep the 11 as working capital. He insisted they put it back in a tin box under a floorboard. They compromised. They put it in the Gretchen Flats Savings Bank under both their names, which was new enough, a concept for each of them that they both stood at the teller window slightly longer than necessary, reading the deposit slip. The payment to Meridian Agricultural went out by bank draft on a Wednesday. They received confirmation of receipt and full loan satisfaction 12 days later. Evelyn put the confirmation letter in Clara's recipe book, between 2 pages she had been using often enough that it wouldn't get lost. It seemed like the right place for something that represented the house surviving. But Drake had one more move. They heard about it from Oakes, who heard it from the feed store operator in Gretchen Flats, who had it from someone at the county assessor's office. Drake was contesting the property boundary on the east side of the Callaway land, specifically the section where the creek ran, arguing that the original survey had been incorrect and that the water access ran through land that was properly part of a parcel he now owned adjacent to the Callaway boundary. It was a surveying dispute, which meant lawyers and official surveys and county records, and it was exactly the kind of slow, expensive grind that could outlast a family's ability to fight it, even after the immediate financial threat was resolved. Drake had understood clearly that the loan was going to get paid. Perhaps he had sources at Meridian who'd told him, and he had prepared this instead. Harper was the one who found the angle. She came to the kitchen table one morning with her maps spread out, 3 of them, and she put them side by side and looked at Evelyn and said, "Come here." Evelyn came. Harper pointed to the easternmost map, hand-drawn, detailed, with the fine annotation lines she'd developed over months of work. "I mapped this section in November, both sides of the creek, all the way to the boundary markers." She pointed to a specific notation. "These are the original survey stakes. I found them when I was working out there. They're still in the ground." Evelyn looked at the map. "How accurate is this?" "I cross-referenced it against the county survey records from the land office. Oakes got me a copy last fall." Harper's voice was careful, controlled, but her eyes were lit with something she was working not to show. "Drake's boundary claim puts the creek line 40 yards east of where it actually runs. The survey stakes contradict his claim exactly." Evelyn looked at her. "You know what these maps are worth?" "Yes," Harper said. "I've known for 2 weeks. I wanted to be sure before I said anything." "You were checking your own work." 3 times. She looked slightly embarrassed about that. "I wanted to be right." "You are right," Evelyn said. Harper, this is real evidence." "I know." She rolled the maps carefully and tied them with string. "I thought we should probably get them to a lawyer." They got them to Cutter, who had been useless to Evelyn in Millhaven, but who turned out to be better at property disputes than personal advocacy, and who looked at Harper's maps with the expression of a man who has just been given something unexpected and useful. He cross-referenced them against the official county records himself, and came back 2 days later and said that in his professional opinion, the boundary claim Drake was filing was not going to survive contact with an accurate survey. "Where did these come from?" he asked. "My daughter made them," Grant said. Cutter looked at Harper, who was sitting beside her father in the lawyer's office with her arms crossed and her expression attempting to be neutral about the compliment she could feel coming. "Young lady," Cutter said, "these are better than the county's own survey records." Harper looked at the wall above his head and said, "I know." Evelyn put her hand over her mouth. The legal response to Drake's boundary claim was filed the following week, with Harper's maps as primary supporting documentation. The county surveyor was dispatched to locate the original boundary stakes, which were exactly where Harper's maps indicated. And within 3 weeks, Drake's challenge had been formally dismissed. The night they received the dismissal, Evelyn made a proper supper. Not elaborate. She wasn't one for elaborate when plain was more honest. and they ate together at the kitchen table, the four of them, and this time the silence between them was not the old kind. It was the kind that comes after something has been survived together, the quiet of people who know what they went through to be sitting where they're sitting. Sadie, halfway through supper, said, "Is he going to come back?" Everyone looked at her. She asked it the way she asked most things now, plainly, looking at whichever adult she thought would answer it straight. Grant said, "I don't think so." "Why not?" "Because there's nothing left for him to try." Sadie considered this. "Good," she said, and went back to her food. Harper looked at Evelyn across the table with an expression that was 18 different things at once, none of which she was going to name out loud, and Evelyn looked back at her with the same understanding. Later, after the girls had gone up, Grant and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee, which was cold by then, but neither of them moved to do anything about it. The confirmation of the survey dismissal was on the table between them, and the kitchen was quiet in the deep specific way it got after 10 o'clock, and the ranch was out there in the dark being what it was. "Harper's maps," Grant said. "I didn't know she'd been doing that." "I know. I should have known." He said it without dramatics, just plain acknowledgement of a gap. "She's been out there for months, doing that work, and I didn't—" "You knew she was out there," Evelyn said. "You just didn't know what she was doing while she was." He looked at the table. "I've missed things." "Yes," she said, because she wasn't going to disagree just to make him feel better. "But you're paying attention now." I was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about Sadie at the hearing, the way she—" He stopped. 4 years. She didn't speak for 4 years, and then she was ready, Evelyn said. She needed to say something worth saying. He looked at her. "You knew it was going to happen?" "No, I hoped." She wrapped her hands around the cold cup. "Hoping and knowing are different things. I've learned not to confuse them." He nodded slowly. Outside, the spring wind moved through the timber on the ridge with the easy sound it made when the temperature was above freezing, a different sound than the winter wind, lighter, less compressed. The seasons were turning. The ranch had made it through winter and through Drake, and through a courtroom, and through a survey dispute, and it was still standing, and the people in it were still in it. Grant reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a gesture, not a performance, just his hand on hers, rough from work, completely steady. She turned her hand over under his. They sat like that for a while. In the kitchen that had held all of it, with the cold coffee and the dismissal letter and the maps rolled up on the counter. Harper's maps, which had saved the East pasture and probably the whole East water line, and the fire going low in the stove, and the mountain settling around the house the way it did every night. Indifferent and enormous, and somehow also, inexplicably, theirs. She thought about Thomas and the tin box, and the garden she never planted, and Mill Haven and the boarding house room that smelled like someone else's soap. She thought about a freight driver on a porch step saying, "You look like a woman with nowhere to be." She thought about climbing up onto that wagon seat before the sun had cleared the horizon, with $1.70 in her pocket and 2 bags that held everything she'd kept. She had not known what she was going toward. She had not, in fact, known much at all. But here was a kitchen table and a man's hand over hers and 2 girls sleeping upstairs. One of them dreaming over her maps and one of them talking again in the voice that had been silent for 4 years. And outside was a mountain they had just together managed to keep. It was not smooth. It was not what anyone would have planned. But it was real, all of it, which was the thing she had wanted most without knowing how to ask for it. She left the coffee where it was and didn't move her hand. Spring came to the mountain the way it always did. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in pieces. One warm day, followed by a cold snap. Followed by 2 warm days, followed by a late frost that killed the early blossoms on the apple tree by the barn. Evelyn replanted what needed replanting without complaint. She had learned, in her first full year on the mountain, that the ranch did not accommodate impatience. You worked with what the season gave you, and you held your plans loosely enough that they could survive being revised. She was in the kitchen garden on a Thursday morning in late April when Oakes came up the road with his wagon, earlier in the season than his usual supply runs. She could tell from the pace he was driving that he had something to say. He pulled up at the yard gate and climbed down and didn't bother with preamble. "Drake's finished," he said. She straightened up from the garden bed and looked at him. County Sheriff's Office, out of the seat, issued a formal inquiry 2 weeks ago. Something about the land deals in the Valley Corridor, the way he acquired the Whitmore property, specifically, and 2 others before that. Turns out there were some irregularities in how he applied pressure to the lenders. Oakes pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands. Someone at Meridian Agricultural talked. Apparently Drake's arrangement with them on your loan wasn't the first time he'd used that bank as a mechanism. There are 4 other ranchers in the valley who had their loan terms manipulated in the same way, and 3 of them lost their properties. Evelyn stood in the garden with her work gloves on and listened. He's been asked to appear before the County Board of Inquiry. His lawyers are already trying to negotiate the terms of it, which usually means a man knows the evidence isn't going to be friendly. Oakes looked at her steadily. He's pulling out of the region, sold his office in Gretchen Flats last week. Word is he's moving his operation east, away from the inquiry's jurisdiction. She thought about a man in good wool and pale, calculating eyes who had looked at this family and found its most vulnerable points and pressed on them without hesitation. She thought about Sadie being brought into a courtroom and asked to defend her own home. She thought about Grant reading that acceleration letter at the kitchen table with his face completely controlled and the $40 gap, and Harper's maps rolled up on the counter, and all the ways this family had bled to hold what was theirs. Good, she said. It came out flat and final, and she didn't dress it up with anything else because she didn't feel like dressing it up. Some things deserved exactly the weight of the word, and nothing more. She told Grant that evening, after supper, while Harper and Sadie were in the main room. He heard it the same way she'd heard it, straight through, without interruption, and then a long quiet. It doesn't give back what the other families lost, he said. No, she said, it doesn't. The Whitmore place is gone. The Hendersons sold before the inquiry, so that won't be reversed. He looked at the table. There are people who didn't have what we had. She understood what he meant. They had Harper's maps. They had Evelyn's savings. They had, by some combination of stubbornness and luck, and a 9-year-old girl speaking 2 words in a courtroom at exactly the right moment, held on. Other families hadn't. That was the truth of it, and she respected him for not letting the relief of their own survival crowd it out. What do you want to do about it? She asked. He looked at her. What do you mean? You know what I mean. The inquiry is open. The other families may have standing. Oakes will know who to talk to. She looked at him steadily. You could make a statement. What happened to us is documented. If it helps establish what he did to others. Yes, Grant said, before she'd even finished. Yes, we do that. He rode her down to the county seat the following week and gave a formal statement to the inquiry board. He brought the Meridian letters, the documentation of the loan acceleration, and the dates of Drake's property visit alongside the welfare petition. The inquiry board added it to an increasingly substantial file. Evelyn heard later from Oakes that Grant's testimony had been one of the clearest accounts they'd received, because he gave it in plain language without grievance or performance, just the facts in the order they'd happened, and the board had been able to follow every step of Drake's method. She was not surprised. Grant Calloway communicated the way he did everything, precisely, without waste, meaning exactly what he said. Drake did not return to the region. The inquiry board's findings were published in the summer, and they were not gentle, and the legal consequences that followed ensured that his capacity to operate in the same manner in other places was significantly reduced. It wasn't perfect justice. It never was. But it was the kind of real consequence that had a practical effect on the future, and Evelyn had learned by then to value that over the cleaner, more satisfying justice that only existed in stories. She thought sometimes about the things you can't fix and the things you can, and how the wisdom is in knowing which is which, and not wasting your life being furious about the difference. That was one of the things the mountain had taught her. Summer came fully and the ranch ran well. The breeding stock had recovered from the previous year's reduction, and the cattle operation produced better than Grant had projected. He told her this at the kitchen table with the careful understatement of a man who is pleased about something and doesn't want to invite disaster by saying so directly. And she said, "That's good news," with equal understatement, and they both understood they were talking about more than cattle. The kitchen garden was the best she'd ever kept. She had planted it in March from the plans she'd been drawing for 3 years. The same plans that had existed only on brown paper in a house in Mill Haven that no longer belonged to her. And by July, it was producing more than the household could eat, which meant she was taking surplus down to the nearest valley settlement on Oakes's supply runs. And the women there began asking about her methods, and she told them. And 2 of them started kitchen gardens of their own the following spring using her seed stock. Sadie's voice came back fully by summer. Not all at once. It had been a gradual process since the courtroom. Words added to her vocabulary of use a few at a time, like someone testing ice before committing their full weight. But by June, she was talking at the supper table, not constantly, not loudly, still in the considered way of someone who treats words as specific instruments rather than general noise. She would say things at meals that were so precisely observant that the whole table would go quiet for a moment after. The way you go quiet when someone says something that is exactly right. One evening she said, "The brown hen has been hiding eggs behind the feed box. I've been collecting them. There are 14. Grant looked at her. "How long have you known that?" Sadie thought about it. 3 weeks? "And you didn't say anything?" "I was counting them," she said, with perfect logic. Harper laughed. A real laugh. The kind she didn't manufacture for anyone's benefit. The kind that came out of her when something caught her genuinely off guard. It was a sound that Evelyn had been hearing more of as the months went on, and every time she heard it, she felt something in her own chest that she'd given up trying to name and had just decided to be grateful for. Harper was 17 by summer, and the maps had become something Evelyn could only call a vocation. She had moved beyond the ranch boundaries and was mapping the valley corridor, the creek systems, the survey discrepancies in the surrounding land that decades of informal boundary keeping had accumulated. The county surveyor, a methodical man named Garrett, who had been impressed by her work during the Drake dispute, had started corresponding with her. He had sent her 3 professional surveying manuals and a letter saying that if she was interested in formal training, there were programs available at the Technical Institute in the city, and that her natural aptitude was as good as he'd seen in 20 years of the profession. Harper had read this letter 4 times before showing it to Evelyn. "He's saying I could do this professionally," Harper said. She said it in the careful tone of someone testing whether the word is allowed in the sentence. "That's what he's saying," Evelyn agreed. "That would mean leaving." She looked at the letter and not at Evelyn. "The ranch. For school, not forever. Dad needs Harper." Evelyn waited until the girl looked at her. "Your father runs this ranch. He ran it before I came, and he'll run it after you go to school. I'm here. Sadie's here." She paused. "What do you want?" Harper was quiet for a long time. 17 years old, with red hair, and her mother's fine bones, and her father's precision, and 4 years of holding a family together by sheer will built into every part of how she stood in a room. "I want to make maps," she said. It came out almost defiant, like she expected to have to defend it. "Then make maps," Evelyn said. Harper looked at her. Something moved through the girl's expression. Not quite belief, not yet, but the beginning of believing that belief was possible. She showed the letter to Grant that evening. Evelyn was in the kitchen and did not listen because this was between them, but she heard the tone of the conversation, Grant's low, careful voice, Harper's higher one with the familiar tension in it, and then something shifting, something easing. And when Harper came back through the kitchen 20 minutes later, her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. "He said yes," she told Evelyn. "Of course he did," Evelyn said. Harper stopped in the kitchen doorway. She had something she wanted to say and was figuring out how to say it, which meant it was something real. "I didn't make it easy," she said finally. "When you came, I made it hard." "Yes," Evelyn said. "You did." Harper's mouth curved at the corner, wry, self-aware. "Most people would say something kind there. Most people would be managing your feelings instead of respecting them," Evelyn said. "You made it hard because you'd been hurt and you were protecting your family. I understood it. I didn't always enjoy it, but I understood it." The girl looked at her for a moment. "You stayed anyway?" "I stayed anyway." Harper nodded once, in the decisive way she had when something had been settled. Then she went upstairs, and Evelyn heard her telling Sadie the news, and Sadie's response was immediate and characteristically precise. "The city is 400 miles. Will you write letters?" "Yes," Harper said. "With maps?" A pause. Then, "Obviously." The house filled with the sound of them arguing companionably about the content of hypothetical future letters, and Evelyn stood at the stove and listened and thought about all the ways silence fills back up with life when you give it enough time and enough reason. She thought about that a lot, that year and after. There is a thing that happens when you survive something that was supposed to finish you. Not a transformation. That word implies a cleanliness that isn't honest. What actually happens is messier and slower. You carry the old thing with you, the grief, the loss, the specific shape of the wound, and you also carry the new thing, and they exist in you at the same time, And on good days you can hold both of them, and on hard days, one or the other gets too heavy. The wisdom is not in getting past the weight. The wisdom is in learning to walk with it. Evelyn had left Mill Haven with a trunk, 2 bags, and the particular bitterness of someone who has been discarded by people who claim to be decent. She had not left it behind. It was still in her, that bitterness. She felt it sometimes, on certain days, when she saw how quickly people decided that an unprotected woman was someone they didn't need to be responsible for. She thought she would carry it the rest of her life. But she had also learned that carrying a thing is not the same as being crushed by it, and that what you do with the weight matters more than whether you can make it disappear. She had walked up a mountain because she had nowhere else to go. She had stayed because she found something worth staying for. Those two facts were both true simultaneously, and she had stopped trying to make one more noble than the other. People rarely arrive in the right place for the right reasons. They arrive, and then they make choices, and the choices are what determine who they become. She had chosen to stay. She had chosen to speak in a courtroom. She had chosen to cut the stitches on a leather pouch and put Thomas's careful savings on a kitchen table in service of a future Thomas had never known. She had chosen this family, and this mountain, and this life, which was not smooth or simple or free of cost. It was without question the most right thing she had ever done. Grant was not easy, and she had stopped expecting him to become easy, because that was not what she wanted. What she wanted was real, and real is rarely easy. He was still a man who processed things internally before he spoke, who showed affection through action rather than words, who would fix a fence post in driving rain rather than talk about what was bothering him and then come in and be completely present at the supper table as if it had never been difficult. He was also a man who, one morning in late autumn of that first married year, came into the kitchen and put a folded piece of paper on the table beside her coffee cup and went back out without saying anything. She unfolded it. It was a drawing, rough, not practiced, the hand of someone who was working in a medium they didn't usually use. A kitchen garden laid out in careful rows with annotations about what went where. At the bottom, in his spare handwriting, for the south section, when you're ready. She had been thinking about expanding the garden since spring and had not said anything about it because there was always something more pressing. He had noticed anyway. She folded the drawing back along its creases and put it in Clara's recipe book, next to the loan satisfaction letter, and went out to look at the south section. The years went on the way years do on a working ranch, marked less by dates than by seasons, by the qualities of different winters, by which animals were born and which were lost, and how the creek ran in July versus how it ran in March. Sadie grew into herself steadily, the way children do when they have been given room and patience and the understanding that their particular way of being in the world is not a problem to be solved. She was 10, then 11, then 12, with her wooden box of collected things growing more elaborate, feathers and stones and pressed flowers, and a piece of blue glass she'd found in the creek that she said the light went through differently than anything else. She had a talent for observation that nobody who met her ever forgot. She would say things that stopped conversations, not because they were dramatic, but because they were simply, completely accurate in a way that most people talked around without arriving at. One autumn, a neighbor from the next valley, a woman named Mrs. Farrow, who had come to help with the harvest, said to Evelyn quietly, "That child sees things." Evelyn said, "Yes, he always has." Mrs. Farrow looked at Sadie moving through the kitchen with her particular self-contained attention and said, "You must be proud." Evelyn thought about 4 years of silence and paper notes and a courtroom in March, and one word spoken in a rough, unpracticed voice. "Every day," she said, and she meant it without qualification. Harper left for the Technical Institute the following September with 3 trunks and a leather map case Grant had made for her over the summer in the evenings after dark, hand-stitched, with her initials pressed into the leather in the deliberate way of someone who has been planning the gift for a long time. She held it in both hands when he gave it to her and looked at it and did not say anything for a moment, and then said, "You made this," in a voice that wasn't quite steady. "Yes," Grant said. "The stitching's not professional." "It's perfect," she said. He said, "It's not, but it'll hold." That was as close as the two of them got to the conversation underneath, which was, "I see you, I always saw you. I'm sorry for the times it didn't show. And, I know, and go, and I'll be here." Evelyn stood on the porch and watched the wagon take Harper down the mountain road, and Sadie stood beside her and slipped her hand into Evelyn's without looking up, and they watched until the wagon went around the bend in the timber and was gone. "She'll write," Sadie said. "I know she will. With maps. I'm counting on it." Sadie was quiet for a moment, then, "Is it sad when things change?" Evelyn thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about things when Sadie asked them. "It's both things at once," she said. "Sad and right. You have to hold them together." Sadie considered this. "That sounds hard." "It is, but you get better at it." The girl leaned against her side, still looking at the road where the wagon had been. "You're good at it," she said. Evelyn looked down at her. This child who had been silent for 4 years and now said the truest things of anyone she'd ever known. "I had to learn it the hard way," she said. "Most good things are like that," Sadie said. She was 11 years old. The community came to them gradually, the way trust comes to people who have earned it without performing the earning. Evelyn had not set out to be known beyond the ranch. She had come to the mountain to disappear from one life and find out if there was another one waiting, and she had found it, and for a long time that was enough. But the kitchen garden surplus had been going to the valley settlement for 2 years, and the women who had started their own gardens using her methods had started coming to her with questions, and somewhere in the answering of questions she had become a resource, which was a different thing than being a charity case or a curiosity or an inconvenient widow, and she found that she was not indifferent to the difference. She helped a woman named Ruth Stanhope save a failing kitchen garden in August by identifying a soil problem Evelyn had seen before on the mountain. She attended 2 births in the valley, in the capacity of someone who had experience and steady hands, both times at the request of the families involved. She corresponded with the school teacher in Gretchen Flats about getting books sent up to the mountain settlement, and the books came, and the children who received them included 3 girls who had previously had access to nothing beyond the Bible and a primer. She did none of this for credit. She did it because it was in front of her and she knew how to do it, which was, she had come to believe, the most honest reason to do anything. Millhaven was not a place she visited or thought about often, but there came a day in her 3rd year on the mountain when she passed through it on a supply trip, the first time she'd been back since Oakes's wagon had carried her north. She drove through the main street herself, the ranch wagon, and the town looked the same as it had looked, which was small and ordinary and certain of its own centrality in a way that small towns are. She saw Harriet Bowles on the street, the woman who had stood on her porch and watched the eviction and gone back inside. Harriet saw her. There was a moment, brief, specific, the kind of moment that holds years of unspoken accounting. And then Harriet nodded at her once, with the particular minimalism of someone who is acknowledging a debt without quite paying it. Evelyn nodded back. She did not stop. She had what she needed from the dry goods, and the ranch was a 2-day ride, and Grant and Sadie were at home. She drove out of Millhaven and did not look back at it. And somewhere on the north road, climbing back into the mountains with the timber closing in on either side and the air going cleaner and colder and carrying the smell she had come to think of as hers, pine resin and creek water and altitude, she felt the last of it release. Not forgiveness, exactly. That word implied the thing had been done to her by accident, and she didn't think it had been accidental, just release. The loosening of a grip she hadn't realized she'd been maintaining. She was not the woman the town had discarded. She had not been that woman for a long time. She was the woman who had climbed the mountain. Harper's first letter arrived in October, written on good paper with a small map of the Institute campus in the margin, annotated with arrows pointing to the library, the surveying equipment room, and what she labeled simply best window. The letter itself was 4 pages, which was more than Harper had said in any single conversation in the time Evelyn had known her. Something about the distance and the page had freed something up in her. She wrote about the instructors and the other students and the precision instruments she was learning to use, and at the end she wrote, "Tell Sadie I found a blue stone in the courtyard. I'm keeping it for her collection." Sadie read this part twice, and then put the letter in her wooden box with the blue glass from the creek. The second letter came in December, and the third in February, and each one had a small map in the margin. The city, the district, a river system she'd been assigned to survey for a coursework project. Grant read every one of them at the kitchen table without comment, but Evelyn noticed that he kept them in the same drawer where he kept the ranch documents, which was where he kept things that mattered. Harper came home for the summer and was different in ways that were immediately visible and ways that took time to see. She stood differently. Something had settled in her. Some constant bracing against the world had eased, as if being somewhere she'd chosen to be had shown her she was capable of making good choices. She was easier to be in a room with, not because she'd become less herself, but because she'd become more. The hard edges now purposeful rather than defensive. She and Grant spent 3 days riding the eastern boundary together, with her map case and his knowledge of the land, and whatever they said to each other out there in the field stayed between them. They came back on the third evening with mud on their boots and Harper talking about a drainage anomaly she'd identified that matched a notation in the old county survey records, and Grant saying she should write it up and send it to Garrett, and the two of them at the supper table overlapping sentences in the way of people who have found, finally, their common language. Evelyn watched this and felt something so specific and particular that she gave up trying to name it and just felt it. Sadie said, "You're doing the face again." Evelyn looked at her. "What face?" "The one you do when something is right," Sadie said. "Your eyes do something." "I don't have a face." "You definitely have a face. Eat your supper." "I'm just saying." Sadie ate her supper with the small private expression of someone who has won the point and is being gracious about it. There is a particular kind of person who comes into a broken place and tries to fix it from the outside, announcing themselves, remaking things in their own image. And there is another kind who simply enters and does the work that is in front of them and trusts that the broken thing knows how to heal itself if given the right conditions. Evelyn had never thought of herself as either kind. She had not thought of herself as any kind arriving on this mountain. She had just been a woman with nowhere to go and enough stubbornness to stay when the easier thing would have been to leave. But she had learned, somewhere in the years of bread and fires and notes on paper and courtroom testimony and saved money and kitchen gardens and letters with maps in the margins. She had learned that the most important things you do are usually the ones you didn't set out to do. You arrive somewhere for one reason, and you stay for another, and the staying changes everything, and the only question that actually matters is whether you're willing to be changed. She had been willing. She had not always done it gracefully. She had made mistakes with each of them. Pushed when she should have waited when she should have pushed, said the wrong thing, missed the right moment, misjudged what they needed. She had not been a perfect stepmother or a perfect wife or a perfect anything, because perfect was not the kind of thing she had available to offer. What she had was presence and patience, and the willingness to sit with people in their difficulty without flinching from it or trying to make it smaller than it was. That turned out to be enough. More than enough. It turned out to be the specific thing this specific family needed, which was not something she could have known in advance, which was the thing about life that undid every plan she'd ever made, and then showed her why the undoing had been necessary. The mountain was still there, enormous and indifferent, when the years had passed. The ranch was still there, the timber on the ridges, the creek running through the center of the valley, the east pasture where the boundary stakes stood exactly where Harper's maps had always said they were. The kitchen garden was larger now, and better, and the south section Grant had sketched on a folded piece of paper was producing more than either of them had projected. Grant was still himself, precise, physical, more present than he used to be, working every day at the difficult business of letting people see him, which was something that did not come naturally to him, and which he kept doing anyway because he had decided to. She loved him for the effort as much as for anything else. She loved him for the letter case he'd stitched by lamplight, and for the folded garden drawing, and for the way he looked at his daughters when he didn't think anyone was watching, with an openness that cost him something every time. Sadie was 13 now, and still collected things, and still said the truest things, and still saw what other people looked past. The wooden box had been replaced with a larger one that Grant had built her for her birthday, with a proper lid and a latch, and it held more than could be easily inventoried, feathers and stones and glass and pressed plants, and a dozen other things that meant nothing to anyone else and everything to her. She had started teaching herself to draw, using the surveying manuals Harper had left behind, and her notebooks were full of careful botanical illustrations with precise labels. One spring evening, near the end of a day that had been long and good in the ordinary ways of long good days. Work done, supper made and eaten, the girls in the main room, the mountain going dark outside the kitchen window. Evelyn stood at the basin washing the last of the dishes and thought about the woman who had sat on the boarding house steps in Mill Haven with $1.70 and 2 bags, watching a freight driver water his horses. She thought about what that woman had believed was possible, which was not much, which was just somewhere to work, just a room with a door, just the next day. She had not let herself want more than that because wanting and losing was a combination she'd already survived once and wasn't sure she could survive again. But the wanting comes back. That is the thing nobody tells you, and everyone eventually learns. You can close yourself down, make yourself small, choose the sure thing and the safe thing and the thing that has the lowest possible cost if it disappears. And the wanting comes back anyway, when you're not watching, when you're making bread in someone else's kitchen at 5 in the morning or sitting on a porch step watching the mountains go dark blue in the evening light. It comes back because it is not something you decide. It is something you are. She had stopped being afraid of it somewhere on this mountain. She couldn't say exactly when. There was no single moment. There was just, over time, the accumulation of evidence that wanting had not killed her, and that the things she had let herself love were still here, and that this, all of this, the imperfect, ordinary daily this, was what she had been moving towards since long before she knew it. She finished the dishes. She put the last cup away in the place she'd been putting it for 3 years, which was the place Clara had put it before her, and which she used because it was the right place for a cup, and there was no reason to change a thing that worked. She dried her hands. She went into the main room where her family was.